George Perkovich is a senior fellow in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Nuclear Policy Program. Matt Korda is the associate director for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. And Janice Stein is the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management at the University of Toronto and the founding director of U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs. Welcome, all three of you, to the Rundown. Great to have you here. I want to start off with George. What did the New START treaty cover, and why was it allowed to expire in February of this year?
Well, the treaty, like its predecessors, covered what you could think of as long-range nuclear weapons. They're called strategic nuclear weapons. But basically, these are the nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia have, which can hit each other's homeland. All right. And it limited the number of the launchers of those weapons. So how many missiles, how many bomber planes could carry those weapons. And then by the counting rules, it limited them to 1,550 each. It expired 2 weeks ago, in part because both sides ran out of gas on arms control, and also the Ukraine war. So they weren't able during the Ukraine war to agree to extend it. The United States has been insisting, with some reason, that because China is rapidly building up its nuclear forces, China should be brought into any future strategic arms control agreement. And also, last thing I'd say is that the New START treaty, like its predecessors, did not cover what are called tactical or short-range battlefield nuclear weapons. And since Russia has perhaps 2,000 of those in Europe, the administration and others were saying those weapons should now be included in the future. That's very hard to do, and so there was no agreement, so everything just lapsed.
Janice, how safe are the remaining nuclear-related treaties? Namely, we've got the 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Could these fall to the wayside?
Well, as George was just saying, there is a lot of concern about China's nuclear program. And we call that the three-body problem. It's easier to model with the minimum you need to survive a first strike and have enough to retaliate. That's been the underpinning of whatever nuclear stability we have. It's easier to do that modeling with two than it is with three. And if you just think about that, that's because you get into the dynamics of, well, what happens if these two ally against that one? And that creates all kinds of dilemmas, frankly. So the Test Ban Treaty, there are leaks, I would say, George, I don't know how else to describe it, from the current government that China conducted an underground nuclear test without notifying, and that it was testing an advanced technology. If there is an all-out nuclear arms race, a nuclear test ban will be very, very difficult to maintain over time. There's no question. There's no question. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is at risk, not because of what China and Russia and the United States are doing to each other, but because of what each of them is doing in their neighborhoods, right?
All right, with that being said, let's have a look at the weapons inventories of the world's nuclear-armed nations, according to the Federation of American Scientists. So this is a bar graph here. You will see in blue reserve and in orange ochre color deployed strategic. Now, these are the total estimates. Russia with 4,309, the US with 3,600, China with 600, France with 290, the UK 225, India 180, Pakistan 170, Israel with 90, and North Korea with 50. Matt, which of these nations are interested in nuclear non-proliferation, and which are most likely to, say, increase their arsenal and develop perhaps new technologies?
Yeah, what's important to recognize is that the United States and Russia have about 90% of all nuclear weapons in the world, but that percentage is shrinking. And it's not because those stockpiles are getting any smaller, but it's actually because of the opposite, right? Other countries are building up their stockpiles. And so they're constituting a larger portion of that sort of overall nuclear pie. And so you mentioned, countries like China, the UK, France, India, Pakistan. Many of these countries are increasing the numbers of nuclear weapons that they have in their stockpiles. Others are increasing sort of the technological capabilities of those weapon systems, and others are doing both. There is really no nuclear armed country that is in the process or anywhere close really to the process of disarmament. Really what we're looking at is that all these countries are embarking on these incredibly expensive and extensive modernization campaigns that are designed to really keep nuclear weapons in their arsenals for the next 50, 60, 70 years, really probably for the remainder of our lifetimes.
George, I'm hoping you can add on to that. What can you tell us a bit about some of the new technologies?
Well, and Matt said it well. So Russia, for example, has 5 new delivery systems of weapons to be able to hit as far as the United States. And it's doing that to be able to bypass any possible missile defenses that the US might put up to intercept those weapons. So there's a giant torpedo that could go underwater all the way to the coast of the United States and blow up a massive nuclear warhead. There is a nuclear powered cruise missile. Cruise missiles you can guide and maneuver so you can make it much harder to intercept them. Russia is building one powered by a small nuclear reactor so that it could stay in the air almost indefinitely. There are several others, all designed to bypass missile defense because the US withdrew from the most important treaty, arguably, which was the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. In 2002, the US withdrew from that, and Russia then said, all right, we'll find a way to work around whatever you do on missile defense. China is adding the number significantly of its long-range weapons and also the technical sophistication of those. And it's also believed, they don't explain, and they should explain, but it's believed that too is to be able to ensure it could beat any US missile defense and also survive any kind of offensive attack, offensive first strike by the US against this smaller Chinese force. And so that's those two. And North Korea is doing something similar, trying to have missiles that could reliably hit the United States to deter the United States from hitting North Korea first.
Matt, very quickly, I want to follow up. How would the US's Golden Dome missile proposal be met by potential nuclear rivals?
Yeah, so as George mentioned, we sort of have a blueprint for how a country is going to respond to a really complex missile defense architecture that gets instituted by a nuclear armed state. So in 2002, the United States pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And at the time, there was a lot of concern from several countries, including Russia and China, where they kind of responded and they said, if missile defense and nuclear deterrence, right, if these two things are sort of at the core of what we consider to be nuclear stability, right, not having defenses and having this sort of mutual vulnerability, and if you take away that aspect of missile defense, then we're going to have to respond, right? And so if countries start building up their defenses, other countries are going to have to build systems that are designed specifically to circumvent those defenses. And so, it takes a long time to build up a weapon system, but if you fast forward, 10, 15 years later, this is why we're seeing Russia and China and other countries too start to build up these systems that are specifically designed to offset any perceived advantage that they can see another country getting by deploying advanced missile defenses, right? That's not the only reason why those countries are building those things. There's a whole host of other factors, domestic reasons, monetary reasons, things like that. But the development of advanced missile defenses is certainly a big one.
Janice, Canada has spent decades advocating for the peaceful use of nuclear weapons and technology. Canada was one of the first signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty 50 years ago. I am curious, would Canada's participation in the Golden Dome proposal undermine all that work and its legacy?
Would it undermine the Non-Proliferation Treaty? No, because we would not be a proliferator, right? the issue really is, as Matt and George have said, that to the extent that you improve defense against missiles, incoming missiles, you actually incentivize powers to develop more and more powerful missiles. It is also true, though, that ballistic missile defense, as Matt just said, is not only aimed at other nuclear powers, it is aimed at states that are increasingly the owners of very sophisticated ballistic missile technology and hypersonic missile technology, which is not nuclear. So technically speaking, and we don't know enough about the Golden Dome yet, frankly. The specs are not there in a really serious way. And I see George smiling there. But as it is currently described, we would not be a violator from that perspective. Whether it's wise, that's a wholly different discussion, but we would not formally be a violator.
All right, George.
Well, I think Janice is right. I mean, I think from the non-proliferation treaty point of view, the missile defense isn't such a vital issue, except, as she said, if it drives people to build up rather than to reduce their nuclear forces. I think the bigger question would be if Canada or other U.S. allies started developing options to make nuclear weapons. So different from missile defenses, but nuclear weapons, that would be a big challenge to the non-proliferation treaty. And there's some discussion in South Korea, once in a while in Poland, perhaps in Canada, that because the US has become unreliable in this regard, people may need to hedge their bets. And so that is a concern about the non-proliferation treaty.
Matt?
It really is striking, just to follow on George's comment, it really is striking to listen to the discussion in Europe about an independent nuclear deterrent. And it's coming not only from the two nuclear powers, but from a country like Germany. So this is a discussion of an entirely different order than we've heard out of Europe, really, in the last 75 years.
Well, let's pick up on that idea of a new order here, Matt. Has the world forgotten how to negotiate regarding nuclear weapons, or is it simply not interested in it, seeing how things have changed a bit?
Yeah, the fact that we're even having this discussion about the idea of countries potentially building their own nuclear weapons is really emblematic of how much the world has changed, right? And how much damage that in particular, the Trump administration has done in such a short time to the global cause of non-proliferation and arms control. But it's not just the Trump administration, right? There are other nuclear armed states that are really, sort of exercising increasingly imperial ambitions against their neighbors, right? Russia in particular, but the UN, I also lump the UN, the US in that as well, right? With regards to Canada and Greenland and things like that. And so we're seeing that, increasingly this era of arms control negotiations and countries really sort of making an effort to sit around the table from each other, finding value in talking through differences and resolving differences in arms control, that era is increasingly over. And what we're seeing is that countries are much more interested in sort of naming and shaming their prospective arms control partners than actually trying to inject a sense of predictability into an otherwise quite unpredictable relationship.
Janice, I want to get your take on that, but Matt talks about sitting around that table. Part of that is having some trust, and I want to help understand how much is that concept important in sort of understanding and negotiating some of these deals.
Well, trust is a glue that makes almost everything possible, but beginning really after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and Soviet Union came to the table with not a very high degree of trust. And you negotiate with your adversaries. You don't only negotiate with your friends, and you actually build that trust through the negotiation process. I don't think it's right to make it a requisite. We will miss a lot of opportunities that way. Unfortunately, I would say we have dug into the stockpile of trust over the last several years and depleted it very badly. In Russia broke a norm in Europe, which is you don't invade your neighbor. Europeans thought that was way behind them in their past. It was very rude shock. And the Trump administration, I could tell you as a Canadian, the Trump administration has been a rude shock to very close allies. So we have diminished trust. And when you're on the downward slope of trust, it's harder to get a negotiation process going than when you're on the upside, I think. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing.
George, what would it take to get major powers, China included, back to the negotiating table?
Yeah, I just picking up on what Janice said, which I think was right on, that you don't start negotiations with trust, you build trust if you have successful or at least promising negotiations. And I would just add to that to answer your question, it has to start with the top leaders. And in the past, when it worked, it was the head of state of the United States or the Soviet Union or Russia, either directly and secretly, usually communicating with each other, saying, look, I don't like where things are headed, we should change it. Or appointing a special emissary, their go-to person that the other side knew, okay, talk to them, they speak for the president or they speak for the general secretary. And that, I think, is the only way out of the current predicament. Is at some point, does President Putin and does President Xi, does President Trump communicate with each other? All right, we got to get this on track, and I'm designating this person to talk to your counterpart. And this would probably need to be in secret, which I happen to think is a good thing. Can be controversial, but I don't see it happening, especially with the United States now, through any kind of open dialogue, because it just gets too spun out and unmanageable.
Matt, I want to get you in here. Janice had mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. For a lot of people, it said that's the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear war. And I am curious, how far close to the brink of nuclear war are we today?
You know, I think what's really important to note, and Janice mentioned this up top, is that, you know, when we think about crises during the Cold War, right, the US and the Soviet Union, these two major nuclear superpowers with missiles pointed at each other, right, that was an incredibly dangerous situation. But what's different about today is that you don't just have these two countries, right? You have 9 nuclear armed states. They all have interlocking deterrence relationships with one another. And so, you know, a crisis that involves just, you know, two countries is almost certainly, you know, likely to spin out of control and involve additional countries beyond just those two. And so, for example, the United States may want to build a new weapon system to respond to something that Russia is doing, right? But then how is China supposed to react to that, given tensions between the US and China, right? And then if China responds, right, China and India have sort of a simmering border conflict. They engaged in a shooting war as recently as 2021. Right? How is Pakistan supposed to respond to what India does, given, you know, historic tensions between India and Pakistan? And so this sort of goes in quite a domino effect, and you can really easily imagine how a crisis that, you know, starts with potentially just two countries rapidly escalates to maybe 3, maybe 4.
Janice?
You know, I just want to weigh in with an optimistic note here, Matt. Okay, you just described what I was talking about earlier, the 3-body effect, where the calculations get so tough. But that leads to accumulation of weapons. It's really fascinating that even though their homelands have been attacked, nuclear powers have not responded with nuclear weapons.
Right.
And I've just finished a piece that nuclear weapons are actually a bad bet. There's not very much return on investment. Iran fired a barrage of missiles at Israel. It did not threaten or contemplate or think about using nuclear weapons. Ukraine responded to a vicious attack by Russia. And the Russians talked about using tactical nuclear weapons. The Chinese and the Indians, at the request of President Biden, spoke out against it. That was it. And the war has been going on for more than 4 years, longer than World War II, and they have not used nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars. Since each of them have a second strike capability, neither side has threatened to use nuclear weapons. So there is still a line here that is very, very, very difficult to cross, despite all these interlocking effects. I think we want to distinguish between building them up and using them. Those are 2 separate universes.
All right, with that,
I'm
George,
optimistic.
George, I'm going to get you in there. As we noted, the U.S. has attacked Iraq, NATO attacked Libya, Iran is now being threatened with U.S. military action. How significant are events like this in swaying non-nuclear nations in considering exploring these options and perhaps, as Janice said, building it up?
Well, I think it goes both ways. I think there's an impulse or to imagine if we had had nuclear weapons, this wouldn't have happened if we were Iraq, Libya, et cetera. And so for bystanders to look and say, Jesus, they should have gotten nuclear weapons. Maybe we should do that. Turns out it's very hard to get nuclear weapons. So each of those countries that we talk about did have some level of ambition to get nuclear weapons, and they were stopped. So Israel has a standard policy. It's done it with Syria, it's done it with Iraq, it's done it with Iran, it's done assassinations with people elsewhere. It doesn't let an adversary get nuclear weapons. The US has kind of said the same thing. So while it's tempting, you have to answer, okay, how long will it take us to get nuclear weapons, and what happens to us while we're trying to get them? So Poland has mentioned this possibility for a very good reason, given what Russia's done to Ukraine. Well, you can readily imagine now Poland's engineers and scientists being assassinated in the streets in Poland, sabotage operations from Russia, if Russia thought Poland was trying to acquire nuclear weapons. How many do you need if you're going to try to go against Russia, which has however many thousands you want to count? So it turns out, whether or not it's a seductive idea, in practice, it raises many more problems than people can readily kind of manage, I would say.
Janice?
Oh, I completely agree with George. That embarking on the path to get a nuclear weapon is a very dangerous process. Iran is where it is today because of that. And, just to underline what George was saying right now, one of the really striking things to me was when Ukraine smuggled drones on flatbed trucks across Russia's border. I went way deep into, the central, the Asian part of Russia, and used those drones against strategic bombers, some of which were part of the strategic fleet to launch nuclear weapons. Russia did not respond. There are, I think, the most powerful anti-proliferation arguments, and I'm looking at George as we say this, we have to make, is they're just lousy investments. They're bad bets. Don't do it. They don't pay off.
And we are going to have to leave it there. Matt, George, Janice, really, really thank you for your insights on this one. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you,
A pleasure
Mike.
to be
Thanks
with
so much.
y'all. Bye-bye.
Bye.